Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest in our Communism and Post-Communism film evening. First of all, let me introduce myself very briefly. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the director of the Danube Institute, and I recognize a lot of old friends in the audience, but for those who are coming to our event for the first time, I'll give the very briefest description of what we do. We're an institute which is established to encourage debate and discussion over a range of topics, not simply politics and economics, but also cultural and historical questions. The film evenings are designed to discuss the way in which communism has been both treated by the film industry and post-communism too, in the years that we've had a popular film culture. And the second is to discuss the ways also in which communism perhaps influenced that industry. Now tonight, we have a film which is not directly about communism, although the two quite different interpretations have seen allegories of the situation of communism in it. One is well, I will not say any more on this because, after all, I have two experts later to discuss the movie. I'm going to introduce, first of all, Michael Walsh, and he will introduce the film. He's a distinguished writer and journalist from the United States. He's held an extraordinarily large number of jobs. He's a writer of great versatility, and one of his jobs has been as the music critic of Time magazine. Another is that he's a writer of successful thrillers. A third is that he works in Hollywood as a scriptwriter for movies, and he finally writes in a number of online presences, such as Pajamas Media, where he comments again on the range of political and economic and cultural topics related to discussions of left and right in the United States. Now, if I went on a great deal longer, I wouldn't be able to express Michael's versatility except to say that perhaps he will demonstrate, it's better that he should demonstrate that versatility himself. So before I actually introduce him and ask him to say, before I actually ask him to say a few words about the film we're about to watch, and later on, as I say, Martin Baranian and he will discuss it and take also questions from you, just two housekeeping points. The first is that at the back you will see copies of the magazine The Hungarian Review, with which the Danube Institute is associated, and I'm in fact one of the editors on it. And those copies are there for you. If you'd like to take one, we would be absolutely delighted, and I hope you will at the end of the meeting. The second is that there has been some food and drink, some of which you've been enjoying, I hope, before in the last 25 minutes. It will be there at the end of the film, and I hope you'll stay and continue discussions. The staff won't be here to distribute it to you, but they tell me that they are handing over the responsibilities of serving it to you yourselves. Just help yourselves to anything you want to eat or drink. So having said all of that, let me, having introduced Michael too, so to speak, let me ask Michael to say a few words about the film, and then the rest of us will enjoy it and return later to discuss it. Mike.
Thank you, John. Welcome, everyone. Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Willkommen. Welcome to our film tonight. My name is Michael Walsh. As John told you, I'm mostly these days a screenwriter in Hollywood, so I've come here from Los Angeles, and as you know, it's awards season, and those of us in the movie business today are voting on the best script, the best movies, members of the Academy, members of the Writers Guild of America, which I'm one, and we have our awards, as you know, coming out in February and March. The movie we're seeing tonight, High Noon, is one of the most beloved films in the American canon. It was produced in 1951 and exhibited in 1952. It did not win the Oscar for Best Picture that year. The director, rather, did not win the Oscar for his work that year, but the director, Fred Zinnemann, you may also know from such movies as From Here to Eternity, the musical Oklahoma, The Day of the Jackal, which was one of his last pictures, and A Man for All Seasons, for which he did win an Oscar, and The Nun Story, for which Zinnemann won an Oscar as well. The reason I selected this picture is it's a little bit different from what we've done in this series in the past. This movie was written by a man named Carl Foreman. A lot of people, when they go to the movies, don't realize that a writer writes the movie. They think the actors just make it all up as they go. But no, actually, we type out the scripts very carefully and we plan. And as you'll see in this movie, it uses a number of screenwriting techniques, which I'm going to bring to your attention, and we might talk about them afterwards. But the writer was Carl Foreman, and Carl Foreman was a communist. He was literally a card-carrying communist in his youth. And because he was a communist, during the McCarthy era, during the House Un-American Activities era, which was right around the time of this movie in the early 50s, he was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee and asked to name the names of other communists in Hollywood. And like many of his brothers, he admitted he was a communist, he no longer was a communist, and he would not name names. And as a result, he was blacklisted, so that for many years he was not able to get work in Hollywood writing movies. In fact, he produced this movie, but you won't see, unless they've changed the print, his name on it, because by the time the movie came out, he was already a blacklisted communist screenwriter. As you watch this movie, well, I'll keep this very brief, but I want to set it up for you. It's set in New Mexico, which is a state in the western United States, and at this point it's not even a state yet, it's just the New Mexico territory. It's in a little town called Hadleyville. And as we open our movie, the sheriff, Will Kane, who's played by Gary Cooper, who was an American icon at this time, very masculine actor who had won an Oscar for Sergeant York and would win an Oscar for this role as well. He is on his last day as the sheriff. And it's his last day because he's about to marry the most beautiful woman in the world, Grace Kelly, this is her first major movie role. She was 23 when she made this picture. And she is a Quaker. She's lost, for reasons we'd never quite find out why, her father and her brothers. So she's against war, she's against violence, she's against guns. She wants him to hang it up and leave. And he's about to do that when, in what we call the inciting incident of a movie, that is the thing that happens that makes our movie, we find out that the baddest bad guy that Marshal Kane ever put away has been miraculously released from jail, and he's on his way back to town with 3 of his buddies, including his brother, to kill the marshal. And now the marshal's faced with an existential dilemma. Do I leave? I'm just married to Grace Kelly. She wants me to go. The stagecoach is ready to go. And yet, how can I run away? So this movie becomes about a man who's faced with the idea of his duty versus his love for his wife and his own sense of self-preservation. And throughout the movie, you're going to notice a few things. One is, very interestingly, they shot this movie mostly in real time. That is, when they say, the stage is coming in 53 minutes, by God, 53 minutes later into this movie, that stage is coming. And you will notice from the beginning, clocks ticking. And there's a constant sense of danger because as that a minute hand goes towards high noon, when the train's coming in, we know that's when we're going to get to the climax of our movie. Another thing briefly about movie structure is that all movies are in 3 acts, Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Act 1 is 30 minutes, Act 2 is 60 minutes, Act 3 is 30 minutes. So you have a perfect 1:2 to 1 proportion in a classic Hollywood screenplay. This is one of them. You will notice the first act will take about a half an hour. You will notice the second act, as our marshal tries to get anybody in this town of cowards to help him, will take about an hour. And then the final act, once the guy gets off the train and the inevitable climax comes, will take about a half an hour. So the movie will run about 2 hours, but again, because it's in real time, the clock ticking, the tension will be very, very strong. One of the phrases we use in screenwriting all the time is, what's the ticking clock in our movie? Not necessarily literally a ticking clock, but what is the thing that's propelling the hero or the heroine to solve the problem before the Martians land or the place blows up or the bomb goes off or whatever the mechanism is. This is the original ticking clock movie. It was very celebrated as it came out. Foreman did not really experience the joy that should have come to him for this movie. And I'll leave you with this thought as you watch it, because we'll discuss this afterwards. This movie is often seen as the cry from the heart of a leftist communist who's being pursued by conservative right-wingers in the political atmosphere of the 1950s in America. And Marshall Cain is meant to stand in for the writer himself, Foreman, and for all of the sort of lone leftists who thought they were fighting the system and were doing the right thing. It's my contention, and I want you all to join in the discussion afterwards, that now, 50, 60, how many years later, it's completely the opposite. That if you look at it, it appears now to be a movie about a conservative, as we would say in America, a lone, brave, very American guy, because this is a movie about guns as well, and it's about violence. You know how close to our American hearts those subjects are. It's about one lone guy against a whole town of lockstep thinking cowards. So I often say at conservative gatherings, what's the most conservative movie ever made? And everyone goes, oh, I don't know, what? And I say, High Noon. And they go, yeah. And I say, and that was written by a communist. So that just shows you how our approach to a work of art changes as times change. And without further ado, let's get on that stagecoach and go to Hadleyville and see what happens at High Noon. Thank you.
That promise when we wed. Do not forsake me, oh my darling. Although you're grieving, I can't believe in.
How did you like that movie? Pretty good, huh? Lots to think about.
I hope you had great fun. My name is Marton Baranyi. And my first question to Michael is that you've mentioned some screenwriting techniques before the movie. What are these? What techniques could you find in that movie which made it more complex than other Westerns, for instance?
Well, one of the things you may have noticed about that movie is there's not very much dialogue in it. A movie script with everything is about 12,000 to 15,000 words. A novel would be 100, 110,000. I just finished a book that was 75,000. So when you're doing a movie script, it may first seem easier because you have less to write, but in fact it's about 10 times harder. It's the hardest writing in the world. And what you see there with Gary Cooper, I bet he doesn't have 10 pages of dialogue. He says almost nothing. And that's the sign of a movie star. You give your movie star plenty to do and very little to say. And he won an Oscar for that part.
Many of you probably recognize that it's not a typical Western. One could say it's a very atypical Western because it has some elements. There is a saloon, there are some action scenes, although very little, and there are no Indians and with their horses and covered in war paint. There is no bank robberies. There are no, I don't know, bugle calls for the cavalry. Why is it so different from the, and there are also elements of film noir in this movie. Why do you think it is so different from?
Yeah, certainly in the direction. There's plenty of noir. This movie got remade with Sean Connery. It wasn't called High Noon, it was called Outland, and it was set in outer space. If you remember that movie from the early 80s, I believe. So it's kind of a time, in answer to your question, it's sort of a timeless story. One of the things we do when we're writing a movie is we will often write the entire movie, and let's say it's set in 18th century Budapest, and the producer will come in and say, "This is great. Now, can we set it on Mars in the 24th century?" And we go, "Sure, it's your money, right? You're paying for it." But stories are transferable, and this story is kind of a universal story about a man who, I would say it's a very hard way to find out who your friends are in this movie, or not, as the case may be. One of the things that's interesting about it, I should mention, is that the girl who plays Helen Ramirez, Katie Jurado, she was the first Latina, Hispanic, Mexican, whatever you want to call it, actress to win an Oscar. Very interesting, and she made movie history through that part.
Although her part is very typical because she's fiery and she has that typical accent you can find even in the film of Robert Rodriguez or else.
But she was not a character you saw a lot in American movies. I also think that character is very interesting. She doesn't have much to do, and all of her scenes are in that room, except when she gets on the train at the end. But again, screenwriting technique, you all know that she slept with every single guy in the movie, right? You all got that? And no one ever says that, do they? The guy thanks her for buying the store for him, and when he starts to talk about his wife, he stops, and then she slept with the marshal, she slept with the bad guy, she slept with Lloyd Bridges, who's the young deputy sheriff in it. It's a very complex character, beautifully written, so that you know everything about this woman, and she tells you nothing about herself. It's fast, it's very good technique.
One of the most, I think, unusual thing in this movie is that it meets the criteria of Aristotle. So it has the unities of action, the time and place. So it takes place in one small, dirty town, which is just a fly speck on the map, which is not by accident. It's not that common to use all these three criteria in the same movie, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting that there's a book called Aristotle for Screenwriters, and it uses the principles that you just mentioned, unity of place, the principles that Aristotle discusses in the Poetics. And the tighter your story is, the better your movie is going to be. Occam's razor, which says that characters should not be multiplied except out of necessity. A lot of times when we're doing a movie, we'll go through and cut a character completely because we realize that that character's function has been taken by other characters in our script. So it's better to lose a character than add a character. I just want to say, because you mentioned the film noir aspect, this movie is 1950, so we are right at the beginning of the great film noir. There's some in the late 40s, like White Heat with Cagney in 49, but we're moving towards the great film noirs. The only thing that I would say this is not a noir because it takes place outside and it's very bright and it's the Southwest, it doesn't rain, the sun shines all the time. And the other thing that Zinnemann got, and by the way, Fred Zinnemann, it's interesting, was born in Poland, not far from here actually. And
pardon, we could rename our film screening events as Austria-Hungarian cinema because the film we had last time, it was directed by Billy Wilder, and he was born in quite the same area of Poland, which was then part of Austria-Hungary.
Exactly, and don't forget, of course, the great Hungarian director Michael Curtiz, who also did a Western about Custer's Last Stand. They died with their boots on. So it's a very interesting mix of Eastern European sensibility and the American myth that we see in this picture.
And you can see the editing should have gone to Sergei Eisenstein because the editing resembled, I think, the Russian montage school from for instance, from the Battleship Potemkin.
Yeah, well, certainly Potemkin. And again, the music, this famous song, Do Not Forget Me, Oh My Darling, is by Dmitri Tyomkin, who was another Eastern European refugee to America from Hitler after the war. Remember, Hollywood wouldn't exist without all of those people. And so Tyomkin won an Oscar as well for that score.
And of course, communism came to America from Eastern Europe as well.
Well,
to make it more
thanks a lot, guys. Yeah.
You've mentioned the interesting paradox that one time it was seen as an anti-communist movie, and
Right.
then it became a kind of Republican movie. Let me share a quote with you because it makes things more complex, and it says like the most un-American thing I've ever seen in my whole life, and it's I'm quoting John Wayne, and he was simply outraged by the movie because he said that's not how decent Americans behave, and he made and shot Rio Bravo later with Howard Hawks as a response. I think I have an explanation for this, and because you can, if you consider it locally or consider it the aspect that it was Hollywood and America who failed to give a response, who failed to stand up against McCarthyism. But on a global scale, it has a more Republican meaning because America is standing alone. Of course, there are peaceniks. I'm thinking about the Quaker wife, yeah. Or isolationist, but in the end, she is converted to the cause, and the sheriff represents America, which tries to get back from the war after the involvement in the Second World War. What do you think about that?
Oh, I think that's very perceptive. The most controversial part of this movie is the end. So after that Will has killed three of the four bad guys, because his wife shoots the other guy in the back, which is not that sporting, but hey. After he's done this, he has that look of utter contempt on his face. He takes the badge off, he throws it in the dirt, gets on the coach, and leaves. And a lot of people had trouble with that ending. I think partly that was John Wayne's problem. Also, John Wayne was, a big, very pro-American, rah-rah kind of guy, and felt that the depiction of the townspeople was probably too cowardly. But if you had to choose between High Noon and Rio Bravo, I would take High Noon, because it's really the story. I think it's a very American story. It's very individualistic. You all noticed all the ticking clocks, and you also notice once the train shows up, you never see another clock, because you don't know how long that shootout's going to last. And one other thing that's interesting about this in terms of the old American West, the movies give us a sense that these gunfights went on for very long. Most gunfights last about less than 2 minutes. They're over very quickly. The gunfight at the OK Corral, one of the most famous gunfights in American history, probably lasted less than 5 minutes. So this does take some license with the relatively short duration of an old Western gunfight. But it makes it very exciting, and it makes that third act that I talked about, which really starts when the train gets in. You don't know how long it's going to last or how he's going to get out of it. You know he is, because he's Gary Cooper, but it takes a while.
One other thing to mention, that when Carl Foreman, he finally settled in Britain, and he wrote actually the scripts of very patriotic movies. So he wrote the script of the Bridge on the River Kwai, right. And the Guns of Navarone. So he ended up a British, from American communist, he became, so to say, a British patriot. But what I wanted to mention, that the film's, the interpretation of the film's career resembles, I think, the song you probably know, Born in the USA, which is a song by Bruce Springsteen, and it was a protest song, actually, and it became a Reaganite anthem of the
Even
80s.
Though it didn't start out that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I hope, I don't know, we'll take some questions in a bit about whether you feel this movie now has a completely different resonance. Certainly for me as an American, and watching what's going on in my country, both in the past and in the present, this movie, especially given what's just happened in Paris, has a real modern resonance to it. What do you do when you're attacked by bad guys? Do you run and hide? Do you wait for the cops to come? Or do you take the law, so to speak, into your own hands? Even though in this case, this is a lawman. So this movie now has a very conservative feel, where once it had a very leftist feel to it.
One aspect, I think it's this film represents a rupture in the history, or in this aspect too, in the history of the Western genre, because you probably remember the Magnificent Seven, in which the town is of course Mexican, so it's a more evolved way of the Western, but it's a town full of innocent people who are incapable of self-defense. But here the town is really a small town, and it's a small town in the worst meaning of the word. So it's not small because it's friendly, nice, and homely, but it's small because it's pity. The people who live there, or the inhabitants, are pity, and with a few exceptions, like the town's drunkard who is willing to help, and that 16-year-old kid,
yeah,
probably.
Well, he saves he brings the carriage at the end, of course.
So,
you know what's interesting? Let's make a couple points. If you're all film buffs, I don't know if you are, but there's a number of character actors in that movie who seem kind of funny to us now because they were very much younger. Mostly Lloyd Bridges, who plays the deputy that didn't get the job. And of course, Lloyd Bridges went on to a big TV career in America in something called Sea Hunt. And then, if you all know the movie Airplane, he's one of the goofballs in Airplane. So it's kind of funny to see him doing that. And the guy that plays the old sheriff is Lon Chaney Jr., who you may know from all those wonderful Universal movies set out in Transylvania, the Werewolf, the Mummy, Dracula movies. That was Lon Chaney Jr. So he plays the older sheriff, and he has one of the most moving lines where he says, you're going to go out there and you're going to die, and it's not going to make any difference. That what I've learned from a lifetime in law enforcement is nobody cares, and you're going to die alone and in a dirty street, which is a line picked up later on in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, when Etta says to Butch and Sundance, I'm not going to sit here and watch you die. You're going to die by yourself because I can't face this anymore. And it's again part of that whole one or two guys against the Wild Bunch by Peckinpah, same kind of thing. They ride into this town, overwhelming odds, the entire Mexican army. They know they're all going to get killed, but they're going to do the right thing. It's a trope that runs through the Western cinema.
And not to mention Lee Van Cleef, who is
Lee Van Cleef is one of the bad guys, and of course he was in Clint Eastwood's Fistful of Dollars, Few Dollars More movies.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's fun.
And even the faces of the bad guys, they resemble, I think they had a deep effect on Sergio Leone, because his westerns are full with that sweaty faces with a lot of close-ups on both the good and bad guys, because there is a moral lever in his films.
Yeah, and they're not pretty actors either. You know, Frank, the guy that plays Frank Miller's got, all scars on his face, yeah. And Lee Van Cleef always looks like he's going to shoot you even when he's like 14 in that movie. It's a very interesting and very well-cast movie, too.
What's really interesting for me is that the tension in the film is not between the good guy and the bad guys, but between the hero and society, mm-hmm. and between a society that it's unworthy of to be saved, because they are, the film could end in 50 minutes if 10 people were saying that I'm willing to go out with you on a posse, and they would execute the three guys, and when Frank Miller comes down from the train, they would take him and
right.
shoot him.
But then there'd be no movie.
Yeah, sure.
That's the problem.
Yeah, sure.
So in other words, if Will had gotten on the stagecoach there at the beginning and drove off, there'd never have been a movie. So yeah, he has to come back.
What I'm meaning is that the film questions the morality of the average people, that they are capable of. So the whole town is just a bunch of egotists, and you can see that those are pity people, and they have pity dreams. When Lon Chaney says that one day a factory might come here, And so
Yeah.
so even their dreams are on a very lower scale, and the whole society is just on the brink of falling apart because there is no cohesion.
Right, and you all know who the hero of this movie is. It's Helen Ramirez, because she says to Grace Kelly, you know, if he was my man, I'd stay here and fight. And she's the only one who says, dude, man up, right? Everybody else is heading for the exits, and it's her words that turn Grace Kelly's Quaker heart, and she grabs that gun and shoots the guy in the back through the window, and then she scratches Frank Miller, which gives her husband a chance to kill him. But that's one of the reasons that Katie Hirata won the Oscar for that part, because it's such a good part. And again, it's small. If you look at the lines of dialogue, hardly any. But she does it all with those eyes and with that face and with the presence she brought, and that's great acting. It's great screenwriting, too.
You can see the illustration of you probably know the quote from Edmund Burke, who said that, or wrote, the only necessary thing for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. But you can see you can taste some existentialism in this movie because society fails him, the law fails him. I mean, our hero, religion fails him, because religion is just holding back him in his quest, and he's facing a world that is cruel and hostile to him, and there seems to be no escape because the town has a grip on him, and he just couldn't escape from. So there is a huge a sense of fate he feels, but he's able to.
But it's duty as well as fate. He could walk away from that, and he could go off with Grace Kelly and live happily ever after. But he can't. And the crucial moment is when they're driving out of town, and he says, "I can't do this," and he turns the cart around, and they come back, and at the risk of losing his marriage to, as I said, the world's most beautiful woman, which is kind of a big deal, he actually goes back and faces down the bad guys.
Yeah, but certainly there is that's why it's not a film noir, because in a film noir they would shoot not Frank Miller dead, but
Well, they'd both get killed in it.
Yeah.
It would be like crisscross. They'd both be dead at the end of it. Yeah, no, it's not quite a noir, although your point is very well taken. The Zinnemann's techniques in filming it in black and white do resemble some of the cuts from the 30s German cinema and the Viennese cinema, and
because he's
because he came out of it.
Yeah, was part of it. He made a film with Billy Wilder, I think, in the late 20s.
That was Menschen am Sonntag. Yeah, Menschen am Sonntag. Yeah.
And what do you think about the end? Because it's not that common. I mean, probably some of you remember the end of the first Dirty Harry, in which Clint Eastwood takes his badge and throws it in a water tank or something like so, a huge pool of water.
Yeah,
so,
and it throws into like a lake.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. As a conservative in Hollywood, I'm fortunate to have gotten to know Clint Eastwood a little bit, Mel Gibson, some of the major Hollywood stars who are conservatives, either openly or hidden. And in fact, we have a group there that is private, and people who don't necessarily want to come out of the conservative closet and perhaps threaten their careers can join, and we don't reveal their identities unless they've revealed them. But it is, I must tell you, I'm not terribly starstruck, but when Clint Eastwood walks in the room, it's a movie star. Everybody stops, and I mean other movie stars go, "Whoa, it's Clint!" And there's an amazing ripple that runs through.
He's 80-something or...
He looks exactly like he does in the movie. He's tall, and he's Clint. It's just, there's so few movie stars left, but he's one of them.
Let me add something, because I think it's very interesting that Zinman was inspired in his childhood by the novels or pulp novels of Karl May, a German writer who never went. I think he's been to America, but he's never been to the West.
And he certainly was never in the West.
Yeah, and who definitely remained a more popular author in the communist bloc than...
And he wrote most of those while he was in jail, too. That's the best part about that.
So he remained a more popular author in the communist bloc than a more famous and official Karl M. And you can see Karl May's legacy in the in the DDR and Yugoslavia.
Oh, well, they made a lot of movies of Karl May works, yes.
Yeah, but High Noon dealt with American problems in an American environment, but had a huge effect on the solidarity movement in Poland. And when Gary Cooper was dead for almost 30 years, he became a poster guy for the first partly free elections in Poland, which ended, of course, with in Solidarity won that election. So
yeah, it's funny you mentioned Karl May. I have a late friend in Germany, my closest friend in Germany, who was a leftist and was the speechwriter for Chancellor Schröder for many years, and he and I experienced many adventures during the Wende, and later on he came to America and we drove across country, and he was a big Karl May fan. He loved Karl May. He said, "We're going to see Indians?" I said, "Yeah, dude, I'm going to take you to see real Indians." Okay, cool. So we got there. I took him to Santa Fe, New Mexico, not far from where this movie takes place. And the actual American Indians are nothing like that beautiful Italian girl who played Winnetou in the Karl May things. And my friend's face he was crushed. His entire worldview of the Wild West and cowboys and Indians had come from those Karl May movies. It was very funny to watch.
yeah, it was very funny as well to spot the two Indians, lone Indians, before the saloon when Gary Cooper went in. It's up to your questions now.
Yeah.
If I could have a microphone, that I will.
I would like to comment that this attitude of the townspeople were not only something that was like John Wayne was saying, that is not American. I think it is very human reaction. I have myself went to see a movie here in Budapest, and it was about the Hungarians who were rounded up by the Russians and taken to Kazakhstan. And I was moved to see this movie because as a small boy in '56, me and my mother were out, and we narrowly missed getting ushered onto a Russian truck. And who knows where we would have ended up. And I was very disappointed that nobody cared about this movie. Maybe 5 people were in the audience. So I just wanted to share this with you. I think it is a very human reaction in such a town. It's not only any particular location.
Well, you know what they say about heroes is heroes don't know they're heroes until they have to make the decision. That none of us can say, oh, I definitely would have been on Gary Cooper's side, when most of us would say, I think I'll go home to my wife and children. So it's very tough. And what I think this movie does well is it's very fair. Even his good buddy, the guy that marries him, who gives the big speech in the church, by complimenting him, tells him to get out of town. So it's a very complex moral issue that's dealt with extremely well. We have some questions now?
Yeah. It's a very simple question. It's about the judge. That scene is actually more wordy than any other scene.
Yeah, it's quite long, and it's early in the movie, too.
And I'm curious as to what you think about what he says and what he does.
Well, the judge scene, as you know, the judge appears to be this authority figure, the symbol of the law, the guy who, is officiating at the wedding. And suddenly, it's very similar to the character of the marshal. He says, dude, I've been a judge here, I've been a judge there. You saw what those Greeks did to that guy, and he takes the flag down and he packs his books, and he's going to be a judge someplace else. Again, it gets back to the better part of valor in this case is cowardice, and my life will keep on, whether yours does, is sort of secondary to me. And again, it actually sort of proclaims the theme of the movie, John, because someone who appears to be full of rectitude, in a way, isn't, and he runs when he could have stayed.
Yeah, when you see that he removes all the symbols of law and order from the walls, you will know that.
Including the flag.
Yeah.
Because remember, New Mexico's not part of the United States yet. It's still New Mexico territory. So it hadn't been, it was actually one of the last states to come into the Union. Not counting Hawaii and Alaska, Arizona was the last one, came into the Union in 1916, New Mexico just before that. So we're still talking the frontier here.
Thank you. Well, I have seen the film, I think, about in the 70s or something in Hungary. And, you know, when I just read the presentation and the short text of introduction in the website and the newsletter, I was quite shocked, you know. And having heard all the explanations you said, I'm just getting more on John Wayne's side, actually. Because I liked that movie. I remember this movie at the time. And putting it to this perspective, you know, that it is something like you know, showing in the early 50s, people against the McCarthyism, or I would say the conservative movement pushing back the communism. I could understand, you know, why these guys in America, like John Wayne, was quite embarrassed. So it's still, if it's really the kind of allegoric, you know, message to the audience in America, then it's a completely different message there than here. So you understand what I mean?
Yeah, no,
what was it was really the message the director and the screenwriter wanted to say?
Well, there's an old saying in Hollywood that Sam Goldwyn, one of the great producers, he was from Poland too, by the way, said, if you want to send a message, use Western Union, you send a telegram. That scripts should not be message movies. And why I selected this movie and suggested it to John in the first place was that it may have had a message that now is quite a different message, but I don't know if you agree with me. So I'd like to hear from some of you who grew up here whether you feel this is a leftist movie, a communist movie, or a conservative. What do you think?
Can you mention any other singular movie which you can debate on that, whether it is a communist, leftist, or a right-wing movie?
No, the only other, the cognate that jumps into my mind is Pulp Fiction. Is that the most violent, sexy, degraded, sordid piece of crap? Or is it a movie profoundly about religious redemption? I would argue it's definitely about religious redemption, and it's all that other stuff too, which is why we like it.
And to make things more complex, it was one of the favorite films of Presidents Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, but also Bill Clinton, and Gary Cooper himself was a Republican. Mm-hmm. So it's more of a mess than a clear thing.
It's very complicated, but if anyone has an opinion, I'd like to hear it if we have time.
Still coming back to the discussion, because one interesting thing you said, you know, is that a lot of people, you know, quite political heroes, I would say, like Ronald Reagan, like that. I'm just thinking, you know, that in the film, it is not clear what is the actual moral basis on which this guy becomes a hero, you know? Because if he's asked why he stays here, the only answer is, I don't know. And on the other hand, as much as I understand, you know, most of the American conservatives are based on very much on the biblical, you know, perspective, biblical truth, and, you know, the distinction between good and bad based upon the Bible, based upon the religion, the Christianity. And on the other hand, you know, in the film, that perspective is rather negative. So, I mean, after 30 years or something, the first time I've seen the film, there also is a different evaluation in myself.
Well, there's another element that just occurred to me as you were speaking. I mentioned this is a movie about guns, right? And you know, us Americans, we love our guns. And as a shooter myself, and someone who goes to the gun range twice a week in California, I'm always interested in how they show firearms in motion pictures. And there's a subtext here which I had never frankly noticed before. Gary Cooper's one of the best shots in the West, and 4 really good shots are coming to get him. He's not going to avoid that fight. He's going to show them who's the best gun in the West. And that's never made explicit, but you see him, he's got a Colt Peacemaker revolver which does not crack the cylinder, but it has a little gate, that he opens that gate and he looks and he makes sure he's got it. And then he takes that smaller gun and he puts it in the front. He's got a rack full of shotguns and Winchester repeating rifles that he doesn't use. And the bad guys, Lee Van Cleef has 1 gun, another one has 2. But there's a challenge to Gary Cooper that's beyond the moral challenge, is who's a better shot in a gunfight? And he decides that he has to answer that call. It's part of the competitive nature as well.
I'm Janos Horváth. I have seen this piece in America during my American incarnation a few times. And now here again, what comes to me, the question, to what measure does this show the shaping of the community, the United States of America, the nation, or that territory, which is only a territory, and it's trying to find law and order. And now this transition from something to something, that nation which is there now 200-300 years, and what stages. So what I remember at Columbia University, we used to, in the 1960s, people who came from Central Europe, as myself and others, talk about this thing, America. And this movie was quite frequently a topic because of what? Because there were references to the Un-American Activities Committee, that House Committee. And at Columbia University, my professors, time and again, probably not everybody, but reminded that don't be so enthusiastic about the founding fathers and the Americans, and which is a miraculous thing, as we Central Europeans coming to America, there was much of our admiring what has been coming out in 200 years there. Well, the Un-American Activities Committee was the most un-American committee in the American history. It was a kind of recurrent theme, for example, at Columbia University. Now, I'm demonstrating this thing with this exam that, back to my question, do we, this audience, for example, decades later, get the message of shaping of the society, shaping of a nation, and could America regard herself and the rest of the world could be regarded as a sort of a role model for what? Is it a role model?
This movie, Martin will know this too, establishes a trope that's coming in American cinema. The Magnificent Seven comes a little bit later. Most of them get killed. The Wild Bunch by Peckinpah, which I think is one of the greatest movies ever, certainly one of the top 5 Westerns, they all get killed. What this movie is saying is we need violent men until we don't need them anymore. And that speech in the church says, we'll get out because they're going to build factories and schools and stuff here, and we don't need people like you. We used to, but now your day is over. So the closing of the West, and this is part of that, is the changeover in the American character from the man of the gun, the man of violence, the man who does what's right at great personal cost, to the bureaucrats, the civil servants, the administrators, that class. And what you're witnessing in America right now, which is why we have these seesaw elections, we go from a very conservative president to a very liberal president, back to however that swing works, is that conflict in the American characters is, are we those guys? And what they were telling you in Columbia was, oh, forget those guys. We needed them then, but now we're in a much more technocratic sort of place. I think that argument is not over. And the recent election showed that it's very much not over, and we'll see what happens in the next presidential election. But those are two sides of the American character, and they struggle against each other constantly.
But marshals now do have pensions, don't they?
What's that? Yeah, marshals have pensions now, so they're bureaucrats like the rest of us. Any other questions, or John, or are we?
Particularly growing up in Arizona, relatively conservative state. And proud to represent American values here, currently the charge at the American Embassy. I have difficulty seeing this as a conservative film or as or representing communist values. identifying or even representing rugged individualism, even though Gary Cooper is, in the end, having to deal with the people coming in by himself. In some ways, I mean, and also doesn't represent the religious values. He turns to the church, and he's not a person who goes to church. That's not a place that he is normally found. So and the priest isn't able to help him, or the pastor. No place that he goes to that represents the different values is able to comes to his aid. Nor is he able to draw on the authoritarian aspect of somebody who can make people follow him. He has to do it based upon his own ability to convince them. And so perhaps what I'm seeing here is not a conservative or a left-wing film or a right-wing film or even a film that glorifies guns. It's a film that has guns in it, and they help. You need to be able to be a professional and use what you know how to do, and he is a professional with guns. But it's somebody who's believed in the nobility of the human spirit. I mean, that's what he has grown up with. When people ask him, why are you doing this? He doesn't say because I'm told by my faith, or I'm told by that my superiors have told me to do this. In fact, his superiors have said, get out of here. He's driven by something that he can't define, that aspect of this sense that we are here as humans, as people who, as our natural way of doing things, should be to work with each other and help each other out. He goes through this believing that there's something more to getting money for what he's doing. He's not going to pay somebody to help. If you believe in doing this, this is what you should do. And he believes in this. And he believes that because what he's doing is right, that others, of course, will join him. That's how he promotes this to the people in the saloon, to the people in the church. This is the right thing to do. Come join me in this fight against these bad guys. Because we are a community, we work together, we do things. I can't do it alone. And he admits that he's afraid sometimes. He admits to his deputy he's afraid. I can't do it alone. I need others to help me. And as a community, we should work together. And perhaps the troubling end is that he believes in the nobility of the human spirit, and at the end, perhaps he decides that that's a myth. That the human spirit, this nobility that he thought was there, when he turned to it, when he appealed to it, he couldn't find it.
Right, where did it go?
And is that conservative, or is that leftist, or is that, I mean, how do you categorize that? And what are the values that you see in the film?
I think you're absolutely right. And again, it comes back to why we picked its picture in the first place, is that it admits of so many different interpretations. And that ending, which is what makes the movie, after all, really changes the entire moral feel of the picture at the end, where he's gone to all of his friends, and they all have perfectly valid excuses, like the one guy that's going to help him says, wait a minute, dude, it's only two of us again? No, I got a wife and kids, I got to work. So I think, in the end, it's not a political film, however it may have been conceived and how it was received initially and how it now feels to us today. And of course, I speak from the conservative side, that it feels very American to me, but that moral choice that he has to make, and you're right, he assumes everyone's going to see it his way because it's the right thing to do, is suddenly called into question. In the end, it's a very, very bleak ending, and that's actually kind of the noir part of the. What do you think, Martin?
I think there's a lot of St. Augustine in that movie. I'm considering what Augustine wrote about the city of men, which compared to the city of God. So the city of men is ruled by not justice, but power and violence. And you can see that the whole town is like the señorita in the movie, because they are in favor of the powerful and not of the just. So when Cain was powerful, they joined him and they helped him, but when he seemed to be losing his.
That's the speech that the judge gives about the Greeks when they kicked out the tyrant, but then he came back and they all welcomed him again, right?
Yeah. So I think both the town and the Spanish lady has its. You can see on a personal level and on a social level I don't know, process in the movie.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Any last questions before we all go? I would like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Martin and our representative, and of course, John O'Sullivan and Jerry Frost, and Iboya, you are here in the back, Iboya Don, who's helped us organize all this, and to our hosts here, and thank you all very much for coming. Do you have any final thoughts?
I just want to thank you, and I wish you had fun, and see you next time.
Yeah, see you next time.
Before you go, let me add one final thought, which is, of course, to thank Martin and particularly Michael and everybody else, and Iboya and Jerry, but to say that I thought this was an absolutely fascinating evening. It's not over yet. Jerry and I are going to become barmen in a second and start serving you drinks. But we obviously are going to have more of these. I think we're going to have more of them with you, Michael, if we can get you to come along, because obviously you have both an incredibly good grasp of the topic of filmmaking, and secondly, apparently, which I didn't know before tonight, of its relation to Central Europe and the whole region. A lot about this region emerged in the course of our conversation. And one final point, somebody else we're going to invite along is the son of Carl Foreman, because as you said, Carl Foreman later went to live in London, and he became quite a figure in English public life, someone who was often invited on television discussion programs and so on. His daughter has become a famous historian, Amanda Foreman, and his son, Jonathan Foreman, is a very successful and important journalist. He told me some years ago, you know, my father, of course, was a communist in those early days in the McCarthyite period, but he said, you know, for most of the time I was living at home with them, my father was a kind of a strong conservative. He would be reading the Daily Telegraph every morning at breakfast and saying things like, I don't know what the world is coming to. So we might, I think we would like to have an occasion soon in which we get Jonathan to come along and discuss one of his father's other films, which, as you say, he went on to make some very successful films, successful both financially and artistically. So this is the beginning of the year for us. It's our first event of the year. We're going to be many more. I look forward to seeing you all again. I'm going to be absent for a while. I've got a slight sabbatical in Australia. My colleague Gerald Frost will become the director of the Institute, and I'll be back in about a year, less. I'll be back from time to time, but I welcome Jerry to the new position, and I look forward to working with Iboya and with him from afar. But thank you for coming tonight, and I look forward to seeing you on some future occasion, and I look forward to Martin and Michael joining us as well. Thank you.